the 29th of May 1943. Late evening, the air heavy with the scent of cordite and parched earth. The Medinine plain stretched in shades of grey under a waning crescent moon, the sand cold beneath the soles of boots, yet still warm enough to retain the fleeting impressions of tracks. Lieutenant Klaus Weber, a 28-year-old Panzergrenadier attached to the 10th Panzer Division, crouched beside a narrow gouge in the sand, pencil poised over a field notebook. The indentation was peculiar, wide, deep, and unmistakably from the treads of an armoured vehicle. But there was no tank in sight. No turret shadows in the distance, no rumble of engines, no exhaust curling into the night sky. Weber traced the tracks with a finger, noting their irregularity. They ran in a serpentine line across the dunes, vanishing into the darkness. Twice he had counted them, and twice he had doubted his own eyes. His men, veterans hardened by the retreat from El Alamein, had whispered about it earlier that day, a strange American unit that seemed to appear and disappear at will, striking without warning. Some called it a ghost. Others, more superstitious, swore it was a curse from Allah himself, punishing German soldiers for their arrogance in the desert. Weber, trained in the doctrine of reconnaissance and the meticulous collection of evidence, sought neither legend nor superstition. Yet tonight, he wondered. Reports had been filtering in for weeks. Allied forces, freshly landed at Tunisia after the Kasserine retreat, were gaining in both confidence and numbers. The Americans had shipped entire regiments of M4 Sherman tanks and M3 Stuarts into the theatre. Their exact strength difficult to assess. German logistical reports noted a steady increase in Allied fuel and ammunition. Yet reconnaissance patrols often returned with frustratingly little concrete intelligence. It was as if the enemy were everywhere and nowhere at once. For the Panzer Divisions, stretched thin and suffering from attrition, this presented a dangerous paradox. The Americans were striking more often, with greater precision, and yet they seemed to evade direct confrontation until it was far too late. Earlier that afternoon, Weber's unit had conducted a routine reconnaissance north of Medellin. A column of Panzer Es and IVs had advanced cautiously along the narrow tracks carved through the desert scrub. One vehicle, a Panzer IV Orsef H, commanded by Unteroffizier Heinemann, had suffered a direct hit from an unseen source. The explosion left a crater, flung sand in every direction, and sent Heinemann sprawling, lightly wounded, into the dust. No American tank had been visible. The crew's account was consistent. No muzzle flash from a distant gun. No glint of armor plating under the sun. Only the sudden, devastating strike. By evening, the rumor had grown into a palpable tension within the ranks. Panzer crews exchanged wary glances, retelling the story in hushed tones. "The Americans are here, but we do not see them," whispered Feldwebel Richter. "They strike and vanish like smoke." Officers listened, some nodding in serious consideration, others rolling their eyes at what they assumed was desert fatigue or stress-induced hallucination. Yet Weber could not dismiss the tracks beneath his hands. They were real. Wide treads, fresh impressions, leading to a sudden disappearance among the dunes. Weber returned to his notebook. Observations. Treads approximately 42 centimeters wide, depth 5-6 centimeters in the sand, direction northwest. No vehicle visible within 2 kilometers. No sign of infantry accompaniment. Tracks terminate abruptly at dune crest. Recommend further reconnaissance before movement. His handwriting was precise, almost clinical, a sharp contrast to the unease settling in his stomach. The Tunisian sun, already setting hours ago, left shadows that seemed longer, darker than usual, and for the first time in weeks, Weber questioned the reliability of his own senses. High Command had underestimated the Allied build-up in Tunisia. The Axis forces, primarily the 10th and 21st Panzer Divisions, were stretched thin, defending long lines from Gabes to Medellin. Italian formations, often under-equipped and poorly coordinated, could only provide fragmented support. Meanwhile, American units were arriving steadily. Elements of the I Corps, reinforced with armor battalions, engineer companies, and mobile artillery. Intelligence reports indicated an aggressive, flexible doctrine. The Americans moved in smaller, mobile detachments rather than large, consolidated formations, striking at vulnerable points and then melting away before German counterattacks could organize. By nightfall, Weber had ordered a halt for his reconnaissance detachment. Fires were lit sparsely, and men huddled against the chill, sharing rationed water and glancing warily at the dunes. The silence was broken only by the occasional rustle of desert wind or the distant pop of artillery fire on the horizon. Stories of invisible American tanks had reached other units along the line. The 8th Panzer Regiment reported similar incidents near Gabes. Vehicles destroyed without sighting the attacker, tracks that disappeared into dunes or behind ridges, and a creeping unease that no German reconnaissance could fully dispel. Around 2,300 hours, Weber took a brief patrol with 2 scouts. They followed the tracks, measuring, sketching, and photographing with primitive field cameras. The impressions led them over a ridge, into an abandoned wadi, and vanished completely. The scouts muttered about ghost armor and machines that walk unseen. Weber remained silent, noting the angle of tracks and the sand's consistency. But even his disciplined mind could not ignore the growing pattern. These were no ordinary mishaps. Some force, mechanical and coordinated, was operating in the desert as though invisible. The Tunisian night pressed down. Crickets and distant artillery were the only audible companions. Yet the sense of being watched was pervasive. Weber returned to his command tent, a simple canvas stretched over wooden poles, and wrote a detailed report. The number of vehicles lost, the peculiar tracks, and the eyewitness accounts. He included a map with the last known positions of each engagement. He concluded with a line that would later circulate among the panzer officers. Enemy presence confirmed without visual confirmation. Nature of attack unknown. Suspicion of highly mobile armored detachment. Recommend caution. That night, the rumor of an invisible American tank division began to take hold. Word traveled from Medellin to Gabes and Sfax, whispered between units, scribbled into diaries, and muttered across radio channels. Panzer crews, already fatigued from months of retreat, embraced the legend as much for fear as for explanation. The desert, harsh and unyielding, became a canvas for imagination as much as strategy. The rumor would grow, evolve, and follow the German armored forces across North Africa, into Sicily, and eventually into Italy. Lieutenant Weber, finally lying beneath the canvas tent, could hear the distant rumble of artillery and the desert wind stirring the sand. He closed his eyes, pencil still clutched in hand. Somewhere in the darkness, tracks stretched on, deep and unbroken, leading to machines he could not see, fighting against men who could not comprehend them. And in that uncertain, uneasy silence, the seed of a story, a legend, among panzer crews was planted. An American armored force that moved unseen, striking without warning, and vanishing before the eye could follow. The whisper in the desert would endure, as unyielding and mysterious as the dunes themselves. The 10th of June, 1943. The Sicilian coastline appeared faintly through morning haze as reconnaissance flights from Luftwaffe reconnaissance wings reported Allied landings near Gela and Licata. The 1st and 2nd, U.S. Armoured divisions, transported via Liberty ships and supported by British elements, had begun what would later be catalogued as Operation Husky. German and Italian commanders, already weary from the months of desert warfare, were confronted with an unfamiliar pattern, units striking with precision, then disappearing before armoured counterattacks could be organised. Oberleutnant Weber, now reassigned to a forward observation post near Pachino, studied aerial photographs of the landing beaches. The Americans' initial beachhead had been limited in scope, but reports from Panzergrenadier patrols were troubling. The destruction of Italian M13, over 40 tanks, and a Panzer IV AOS F2 near Gela had occurred without a single confirmed sighting of the attacking armour. Soldiers swore that explosions came from nowhere, that shells and rounds found their marks before a tank's silhouette was ever visible. By June 15, the rumor that had begun in Tunisia had solidified into legend. German tank crews, many of them veterans of El Alamein and Medellin, referred to it quietly as Die Unsichtbar Division, the Invisible Division. In the officers' mess of the 15th Panzergrenadier Regiment, conversations were hushed. Unteroffizier Fritz Baum recounted, "We fired at shadows, and they fired back from shadows. How can one fight what one cannot see?" The phenomenon was not limited to anecdotal superstition. 13 fighter command debriefings, consulted post-war, reveal that P-38 Lightning strafing runs and close air support often coincided with these invisible armored strikes. American armored forces had adapted the doctrine learned in North Africa. Fast-moving, combined arms teams, coordinating with artillery and air support, minimizing exposure, and striking at weak points in the Axis defensive line. Though Allied reports did not mention any supernatural tactics, German accounts often described attacks as if the tanks appeared suddenly, destroyed their targets, and vanished before counterfire could be effective. Historical context clarifies the origin of this perception. The U.S. Army's use of light-armored reconnaissance and medium tank battalions in dispersed, flexible formations created the illusion of omnipresence. M3 Stuart light tanks conducted flanking maneuvers ahead of Sherman battalions, often concealed by terrain or smoke screens. The Panzer Divisions, attempting to consolidate in defensive lines along the Simeto and Anapo rivers, faced a tactical environment they were unprepared to counter. When combined with the Luftwaffe's overstretched resources and frequent Allied air superiority, the myth of invisible armor gained credibility among seasoned German crews. Weber personally led a reconnaissance patrol along the Catania Road on June 20. At 0530 hours, his unit encountered another puzzle. A small column of Italian L6 over 40 light tanks had been destroyed overnight, not a single round traceable to enemy fire in sight. Weber noted the scorched earth and shattered tracks, marking each point in his field notebook with exact coordinates. The air carried the acrid smell of burnt fuel and metal, yet there was no smoke rising from recent combustion. The American attackers had struck silently, leaving destruction but no immediate evidence of presence. Patrol reports spread through the 10th Panzer Division and were relayed via encrypted radio to higher headquarters. Colonel von Richter, responsible for divisional coordination, expressed his growing frustration in internal communications. Enemy armored units operating with unprecedented stealth. Losses inflicted without direct observation. Standard reconnaissance insufficient. Recommend immediate deployment of anti-armor patrols, in depth. The language of reports remained measured, yet the undertone betrayed unease. German commanders were facing an operational enigma that their doctrine could not readily explain. Casualty reports confirmed the trend. Between June 12 and June 28, the German 15th Panzergrenadier Regiment lost 14 tanks, 7 Panzer IEs, 5 Panzer IVs, and 2 command vehicles to attacks for which no witnesses could confirm the presence of American armor. Italian units fared worse. The 4th Bersaglieri Battalion reported 22 destroyed light tanks in a similar period, often attributed to mines, airstrikes, or unobserved engagements. Veterans swore they had been ambushed by tanks that existed only in memory. Their outlines glimpsed briefly before vanishing into smoke or behind ridges. The American approach was methodical. Combat records from the 339th Fighter Squadron indicate that coordinated air-ground operations disrupted Axis movements, allowing light tanks and medium units to penetrate defensive lines undetected. Intelligence assessments at the time underestimated the synchronization. German panzer crews perceived these actions as nearly miraculous, reinforcing the legend of the Invisible Division. Luftwaffe reports, already strained by the collapse of forward airfields, documented repeated failures to locate or intercept these armored units. By early July, Weber's notebook had grown heavy with documentation. Sketches of destroyed tanks, maps of attack points, and written observations of terrain and sand conditions. He began noting behavioral patterns. Strikes occurred most often during morning or dusk, Attacks were concentrated on lightly defended columns, and American units seemed to retreat along precisely calculated routes. To his trained eye, it was an effective, well-coordinated tactic, but to the panzer crews witnessing it in real time, it appeared inexplicable, almost spectral. On July 9, the first formal German report using the term Unsichtbar Division appeared in divisional communications. A company commander described the phenomenon: multiple vehicles destroyed by armor not observed. Enemy maneuver appears coordinated, precise, and rapid. Crews describe attacks as if tanks emerge from nowhere, strike, and vanish. Subsequent radio traffic contained similar accounts, forming the foundation of the rumor that would endure for decades in post-war memoirs and interviews with Panzer veterans. Weber's observations extended beyond vehicles. Supply convoys were intercepted and destroyed without engagement. Artillery positions were neutralized with exacting precision. German officers began to theorize that American tank units were experimenting with new camouflage techniques, night mobility, or coordination with aerial observers. Yet post-war records confirm a simpler reality. American armored units employed mobility, air-ground coordination, and flexible doctrine so effectively that the German troops, conditioned by static defenses and predictable patrol patterns, perceived them as an invisible force. By the end of July 1943, the Invisible Division had taken on an almost mythological status among German armored forces. Veteran crews carried stories of attacks that left no trace, of smoke dissipating before observation, of Sherman tanks striking from behind ridges and disappearing into forests or hills. Weber, meticulous in recording facts, understood the phenomenon as an emergent effect of combined arms warfare, but he also understood why his comrades feared it. They were facing an enemy whose movements defied the conventional rules of engagement they had internalized over years of desert campaigns. And so, the legend solidified. The Invisible Division, born from whispered sightings in North Africa, had now emerged in Sicily. Its reputation grew not only from the actions of American armored units, but from the shared human tendency to mythologize what could not be explained, particularly under the stress of combat. Weber, notebook in hand, watched the Sicilian sunset bleed over the ridges. Somewhere in that haze, tanks moved as if unseen, striking precisely and retreating before any German response could be mounted. In the minds of panzer crews, the Invisible Division was no longer rumor. It was reality. The 1st of September, 1943. The Gustav Line stretched from the Tyrrhenian coast to the Adriatic, a formidable string of defensive positions designed to halt the advancing Allies. German and Italian engineers had fortified every ridge, valley, and river crossing, placing artillery, minefields, and anti-tank obstacles in precise arrays. For the panzer crews stationed along this line, the oppressive heat of early September was matched only by the tension of constant vigilance. Reports of the so-called Invisible Division had reached the highest echelons of the 10th Panzergrenadier Division, and commanders were preparing for encounters that might defy reason as much as tactics. Lieutenant Weber's unit had been reassigned to the northern sector of the Gustav Line near the Liri Valley, a corridor that Allied planners had identified as key to breaking through to Rome. Reconnaissance patrols returned with fragmented accounts, tracks appearing in areas already scouted, destroyed vehicles with no apparent point of origin, and artillery detonations timed with uncanny precision. The panzer crews now faced a dual challenge, maintaining defensive cohesion while confronting the psychological weight of an enemy whose presence could not be reliably observed. The first engagement of September unfolded on September 3. A mixed battalion of Sherman tanks and mechanized infantry advanced under cover of morning fog along the eastern slopes of Monte Cairo. Axis observers reported hearing engines and gunfire but saw nothing visible. When the fog lifted 30 minutes later, 2 Italian Semovente 75/18 self-propelled guns had been destroyed, and 1 Panzer IV suffered significant damage from an unseen anti-tank strike. Lieutenant Weber and his patrol meticulously recorded the tracks, tire imprints, shell fragments, and scorched earth, all without any confirmation of enemy sighting. The American approach combined elements that German doctrine had not fully anticipated. Sherman tanks moved in coordinated, echeloned formations, while mechanized infantry exploited terrain folds for concealment. Artillery observers, often embedded with armored units, called in strikes with exacting precision. The combination created an operational illusion. German forces felt as though they were under assault from a force that appeared and disappeared at will. In actuality, every movement and strike followed a disciplined plan. But from the perspective of panzer crews, it resembled something almost supernatural. By September 7, the legend of the Invisible Division had taken on a life of its own. Unteroffizier Baum, now temporarily commanding a platoon after casualties among senior officers, described encounters that left even experienced tankers unsettled. "They are everywhere and nowhere at once," he wrote in a letter later recovered in Allied archives. "One moment, our flanks are secure. The next, our vehicles burn, our men are casualties, and there is no sign of the enemy." Such reports circulated rapidly among panzer crews, reinforcing the perception of an omnipresent adversary and eroding confidence in traditional defensive measures. Axis intelligence reports of this period reveal a growing obsession with locating the Invisible Division. Patrols were dispatched along secondary roads and through dense woods, but American tactics emphasized mobility and deception. Reconnaissance elements, both aerial and ground, fed information to Sherman units, allowing them to exploit weak points and disengage before counterattacks could be organized. German field reports often noted discrepancies between observed destruction and confirmed enemy presence, further solidifying the myth. One particularly striking engagement occurred on September 10 near San Giovanni. A column of Panzer IVs was moving to reinforce a forward position when American armor and infantry conducted a flanking maneuver under cover of early morning mist. When the German units attempted to engage, they found the road blocked by destroyed vehicles and mines, with no visible attacker. Communications intercepted post-war indicated that Sherman units had coordinated with P-38 reconnaissance to maintain situational awareness while avoiding direct confrontation until decisive strikes were possible. The result was the destruction of 3 tanks and partial immobilization of 2 others, leaving crews bewildered and demoralized. Historians analyzing these events note that the psychological impact of the Invisible Division was as significant as its material effects. German officers faced the challenge of managing both the physical defenses of the Gustav Line and the escalating fear among their troops. Reports indicate that commanders increasingly overestimated American strength, sometimes diverting forces unnecessarily to areas where no attack was imminent. The perception of omnipresent enemy armor amplified stress and disrupted cohesion, demonstrating the operational value of psychological warfare, even when executed unintentionally through effective maneuver. By mid-September, Lieutenant Weber began to notice recurring patterns. American attacks were typically preceded by subtle reconnaissance, including the movement of infantry and armored scouts along unobserved routes. Sherman tanks and Stuart reconnaissance elements maintained rapid communication with artillery and air support, striking simultaneously from multiple directions. To the panzer crews, the coordination appeared instantaneous and inexplicable. The Americans exploited terrain, shadows, and timing to ensure that the axis of attack could never be reliably predicted, reinforcing the illusion of invisibility. On September 15, an engagement near Cassino illustrated the strategic implications of the Invisible Division. Sherman tanks, supported by mechanized infantry, executed a synchronized strike on an isolated ridge position, destroying 2 Panzer IVs and neutralizing an artillery observation post. German reconnaissance, hampered by the dense terrain and limited aerial support, reported no visual confirmation of attacking units. Post-war American operational reports confirm that careful planning, combined arms coordination, and disciplined execution were sufficient to produce the effect of an unseen force. For German crews, the engagement became another anecdote, fueling the legend of the Invisible Division. The cumulative effect on morale and operational decision-making was profound. German officers increasingly relied on static defensive positions, fearing sudden attacks from unseen adversaries. Units became hesitant to maneuver without explicit reconnaissance, slowing operational tempo and reducing flexibility. Historians later noted that the Invisible Division, though not literally invisible, had achieved an operational advantage by exploiting the limits of enemy perception and doctrine. By the end of September, Lieutenant Weber's notes reflected a sobering conclusion. The Gustav Line, though fortified, could not fully counter a force capable of striking unpredictably, exploiting terrain, and coordinating attacks across multiple units. The Invisible Division was, in Weber's words, a shadow upon the land. A presence felt more than seen. It was a combination of doctrine, timing, terrain mastery, and coordination that rendered American armor effectively untouchable in perception, if not in material terms. As the month closed, German reports to divisional command consistently referenced the Invisible Division, blending anecdote and tactical observation. Crews spoke of phantom tanks, flanking attacks from unseen directions, and artillery detonations perfectly timed to sow confusion. Allied intelligence later identified these reports as evidence of the effectiveness of American combined arms tactics, though Axis officers at the time interpreted them as either extraordinary skill or, increasingly, supernatural intervention. September 30, 1943. The Italian sun dipped below the Apennines. Lieutenant Weber, weary from continuous patrols and engagements, wrote in his field notebook, "We are no longer certain if what we see is real or imagined. The enemy strikes without warning, withdraws without trace. To fight the Invisible Division is to confront the unknown itself." His words, recovered in post-war archives, encapsulate the blend of operational frustration and psychological tension that defined the legend. A testament to the American mastery of mobility, coordination, and perception management during the Italian campaign. The 2nd of October 1943. The Italian autumn settled across the Gustav Line, bringing fog-laden mornings and chilling winds from the Apennines. German panzer crews had begun referring to the enemy as Die, Unsichtbar Division, the Invisible Division, not as propaganda, but as a term born of practical frustration and repeated encounters. The legend had spread from Tunisia through the Italian campaign, shaped by actual events and amplified by the natural anxiety of troops under constant threat. On the northern sector of the Winter Line, near Monte Trocchio, Hauptmann Fischer's Panzer IV Company prepared for yet another reconnaissance in force. Reports indicated American armor operating ahead of their infantry, appearing in locations previously scouted as secure. Intelligence suggested these were not isolated patrols but coordinated maneuvers of company, and battalion-sized elements exploiting gaps in German coverage. Allied operational planning detailed in post-war analyses confirmed that Sherman and Stuart tanks, paired with mechanized infantry and supported by artillery observers, executed rapid, fluid attacks designed to confuse the enemy and conserve forces. Fischer's unit moved cautiously along the winding ridges, noting broken trees, tracks in soft soil, and damaged vehicles with no clear attribution. The men whispered stories of tanks that fired without being seen, of explosions timed with an uncanny precision, and of flanking attacks that seemed to come from nowhere. Unteroffizier Lang recorded one particularly perplexing incident. "We watched the ridge for over an hour. The horizon remained empty. Then, artillery struck our left flank, destroying the command half-track. No enemy in sight. When we advanced, we found tracks but no tanks, no infantry, only signs of engagement." The Invisible Division's approach combined mobility, deception, and discipline. Sherman tanks moved in echelon formations that allowed overlapping fields of fire while avoiding predictable patterns. Mechanized infantry infiltrated folds in the terrain to provide observation and support, ensuring that any German defensive reaction was always one step behind. From the panzer crew's perspective, the American force struck invisibly, leaving destruction without clear engagement. Post-war analyses describe this as a deliberate combination of combined arms doctrine and terrain exploitation, a calculated invisibility, achieved through operational skill, rather than any supernatural ability. October 7 brought one of the more dramatic confrontations of the campaign. A column of Panzer IVs and Stugs was advancing to reinforce a forward position near San Pietro, tasked with plugging a perceived gap in the winter line. Allied reconnaissance had detected the movement, but chose not to engage immediately, opting instead for a coordinated ambush using terrain, fog, and timing. When the German units reached the ridge, artillery and mortar fire struck from positions that observers had no way of seeing. The resulting damage was substantial: 1 Panzer IV destroyed, 2 Stugs immobilized, and 4 personnel casualties. Hauptmann Fischer later described the engagement in a field report. "We were struck as if the earth itself opposed us. No sign of enemy armor, yet our vehicles burned. The men are shaken, speaking of an adversary unseen but omnipresent. The sense of being surrounded by a ghostly enemy undermines both courage and cohesion." Reports such as this contributed to the growing legend of the Invisible Division, reinforcing the perception that the Americans could strike without warning or exposure. German intelligence attempted to rationalize the phenomenon. Reconnaissance flights, aerial photography, and ground patrols were intensified, yet Allied tactics rendered these measures partially ineffective. Shermans advanced along secondary roads and exploited hidden passes, while infantry units masked movement with foliage and early morning shadows. Artillery observers coordinated strikes from positions often beyond line of sight. The cumulative effect was the illusion of omnipresent forces moving freely through the German defensive grid. On October 12, an encounter near Mount Cairo demonstrated the psychological weight of the Invisible Division. A German Panzergrenadier platoon reported seeing only dust clouds and shattered terrain after a series of hits from hidden enemy positions. The commander, Lieutenant Brandt, wrote, "I cannot swear to have seen a single tank, yet our losses are evident. How can one fight an opponent that leaves no trace of itself?" Post-war Allied accounts clarify that Sherman tanks executed a series of bounding maneuvers, combined with infantry screens, coordinated artillery, and air observation, producing effects that convinced Axis forces they were under attack by a force that could not be seen. The cumulative impact on German strategy was notable. Field reports from October 1943 indicate increased caution, slower advances, and a preference for static defense over offensive maneuver. Commanders worried that any movement could provoke a strike from the Invisible Division, leading to conservative deployment and missed opportunities for counterattacks. In essence, the operational myth rooted in skillful Allied tactics had tangible consequences for German decision-making. October 18 marked another encounter along the Liri Valley. A platoon of German Panzer IVs attempted to secure a ridge overlooking a river crossing. Sherman tanks and mechanized infantry advanced under fog, using elevation and folds in the terrain for concealment. Artillery observers, positioned several kilometers away, called in strikes that neutralized 2 tanks and disabled a command half-track. When Axis units attempted a counterattack, they found no enemy in sight, only scorched ground, tracks, and casualties. Lieutenant Weber, documenting the engagement, noted, "The enemy strikes without revealing itself, leaving us to fight shadows and memory. This is the Invisible Division, though no phantom ever was more real in its effect." By late October, the legend had become institutionalized among German armored units. Soldiers began carrying maps annotated with invisible zones, areas where previous attacks had occurred without visual confirmation of enemy forces. Casual anecdotes circulated. Reports of tanks firing from valleys that should have been empty, soldiers observing artillery shells impact before seeing attackers, and reconnaissance units encountering what seemed like phantom movements. These stories, documented in both field notes and post-war interrogations, reveal how repeated operational experiences could evolve into a structured myth with strategic implications. Despite the fear and uncertainty, German commanders still attempted to confront the challenge. Panzer units adapted by increasing reconnaissance patrols, implementing staggered formations, and coordinating more closely with artillery. Yet every adaptation seemed to reveal the ingenuity of American combined arms tactics. Infantry screening, armoured bounding manoeuvres, and artillery coordination continued to give the impression of invisibility. Post-war analyses identify these adaptations as effective countermeasures, but insufficient to entirely dispel the psychological impact of an enemy whose presence seemed omnipresent yet imperceptible. By the end of October, the Invisible Division had earned its place in German reports, letters, and post-action reviews. The American approach, rooted in discipline, mobility, and coordination, had produced an operational legend, a force that moved with precision, struck with timing, and left no trace except in damage and disruption. For German panzer crews, the month closed with a mix of respect, fear, and uncertainty. As Unteroffizier Lang wrote in his diary, "We face an enemy that is seen only through what it destroys. Perhaps it is not truly invisible, but we are blind to its ways." The winter line remained intact, but the Invisible Division had left its mark not only on terrain and vehicles, but on perception, morale, and strategy. The myth, grounded in tactical reality, demonstrated how effective coordination, timing, and mobility could transform operational skill into psychological dominance. The panzer crews, battle-hardened yet unnerved, continued to document every encounter, ensuring that the legend of the Invisible Division would persist in both history and memory. The 3rd of November 1943. A thin fog hugged the valleys of the Central Apennines, curling through olive groves and abandoned farmhouses. German Panzergrenadiers had spent weeks tracing the operations of the so-called Unsichtbar Division, yet each encounter left them with more questions than answers. The Italian autumn, damp and cold, mirrored the sense of unease that settled over the armoured units as they manoeuvred along the Gustav Line's northern sector. Hauptmann Fischer's Panzer IV Company moved cautiously toward Mount Sammucro, following intelligence of American reconnaissance in force activity. Reports from Italian civilians suggested sightings of armoured vehicles moving along secondary roads and ridgelines, but by the time German units arrived, nothing remained, no Sherman, no Stuart, only churned earth and the occasional scorched engine. Post-war interrogation reports confirm that American units deliberately avoided engagement unless conditions favored tactical surprise, creating the perception of invisibility. The men, increasingly anxious, began referring to what they faced not merely as an adversary, but as ghosts. Unteroffizier Lang recorded in his diary, "We patrol the ridges, we see nothing, yet artillery and tank fire strike as if the enemy knows our every move. The men joke of spectres, but in their eyes is fear, not jest." The combination of terrain, weather, and disciplined Allied maneuvering produced operational conditions that German crews could not readily anticipate. November 7 marked a particularly striking engagement near the town of Sant'Elia. A platoon of Panzer IVs attempted to secure a key ridge overlooking a valley used for American supply movements. Sherman tanks, supported by infantry and forward artillery observers, executed a series of bounding maneuvers that struck the German column simultaneously from multiple directions. The German unit reported losses of 2 tanks and a half-track, with several wounded. Notably, German after-action reports repeatedly stated, "No enemy seen, only effects observed." Post-war analysis confirms that the American force had used terrain folds, timing, and fog to conceal their approach, striking before German units could properly orient themselves. The psychological impact of these encounters became apparent. Even experienced commanders expressed doubt and frustration. Lieutenant Brandt, whose Panzergrenadier platoon had survived several skirmishes, noted in his report, "We fight against what we cannot see. Men hesitate, decisions are delayed. The enemy moves as though he knows every thought, every maneuver." This commentary illustrates how operational skill can manifest as psychological warfare. The Americans' coordinated use of mobility, concealment, and indirect fire produced uncertainty, hesitation, and ultimately, attrition, without necessarily requiring overwhelming force. November 12 brought an encounter that would be recorded in several field diaries and post-war memoirs. A German armoured reconnaissance unit moved along a narrow pass north of Cassino, observing faint tracks in the mud. Attempting to follow, the unit came under mortar fire that seemed to originate from ridges that offered no clear line of sight. One Panzer IV was disabled, and the platoon withdrew, having failed to identify the enemy. The incident reinforced the notion of the invisible division, an operational force that, through skill and discipline, could strike without detection. German intelligence officers attempted to rationalize the phenomenon. Reconnaissance flights increased in frequency, and coordination with artillery units was tightened. Yet every effort to observe and track the American forces met with partial success at best. Sherman and Stuart tanks moved along less obvious routes, coordinated with infantry using terrain for concealment, and timed strikes to exploit weather and visibility. From the German perspective, the Americans were everywhere and nowhere, striking from the fog, the folds of the land, and the obscured valleys. On November 18, Hauptmann Fischer's unit encountered another example of American operational ingenuity near the Rapido River. The German company observed tracks suggesting movement, but by the time they reached the supposed location, the valley was empty. Artillery fire then fell from forward observers hidden among olive groves and hillocks, disabling 2 more tanks. Fischer's report reflected a growing sense of resignation. "We are forced to fight the effects of an enemy we cannot see." Morale suffers as men question whether engagement is possible without certainty of contact. The Invisible Division's reputation was further cemented by reports of what German troops described as phantom columns. On November 22, a German supply convoy reported seeing dust and smoke rising along a ridge, suggesting the approach of tanks. Preparations for engagement were made, yet upon arrival, the ridge was empty. The convoy continued, only to find that artillery had already struck forward positions, damaging vehicles and killing personnel. Post-war studies indicate that these were likely elements of American armor performing reconnaissance and screening, deliberately leaving only minimal evidence of their presence while coordinating indirect fire. By late November, the Invisible Division had become more than an operational curiosity, it had affected German strategic thinking. Reports from the northern Apennines suggested increased caution, slower advances, and over-reliance on static defense. Commanders worried that any movement could provoke an unseen strike, causing hesitation in deploying units and leaving gaps in defensive coverage. The combination of skillful Allied tactics, terrain exploitation, and psychological pressure had achieved an effect disproportionate to the actual force strength involved. One striking example occurred on November 28, during a coordinated German counterattack near the town of Piedimonte. A Panzer IV company attempted to advance along a ridge, only to find it swept by artillery and mortar fire from positions that were neither observed nor reachable by direct line of sight. Infantry screening and armoured bounding movements ensured that German units could not locate or engage the attackers. The result was 2 immobilized tanks and a retreating column. Lieutenant Weber, in his post-action report, summed it up. "We fight shadows and are struck by ghosts. The men speak in hushed tones of the Invisible Division, a name earned through deeds, not rumour." By the end of November, German field manuals and internal reports contained repeated references to the Invisible Division. Though the name was informal, its meaning was clear. An enemy force that struck effectively without direct observation, using combined arms tactics, terrain advantage, and operational discipline. In effect, what had begun as rumour in North Africa had now become an operational reality in Italy. Panzer crews adapted cautiously, increasing reconnaissance, staggering formations, and coordinating with artillery. Yet the Americans' ability to exploit terrain and conceal movement continued to produce both material and psychological effects. The month closed with Hauptmann Fischer writing in his field log, "The enemy moves unseen but not unfelt. Each strike teaches caution, patience, and respect. The Invisible Division is real, in the sense that its effect is tangible and unavoidable. The challenge we face is to adapt without succumbing to fear." The winter rains began, washing away tracks and masking further movements, but the legend and operational reality of the Invisible Division would persist, shaping the Italian campaign for months to come. The 2nd of December, 1943. The Apennines were already draped in a thin, icy frost. Dawn revealed a landscape of muted greys and browns, the olive groves and crumbling farmhouses reduced to silhouettes against a pale sun struggling to rise. For the German Panzergrenadiers entrenched along the Gustav Line, winter brought more than cold, it brought anxiety, fueled by the persistent reports of the so-called Invisible Division. Rumours, initially whispered among squads in Tunisia and later in southern Italy, had now taken on a life of their own, shaping both operational planning and morale. Oberleutnant Karl Meinhardt's reconnaissance unit moved cautiously along the valley of the Lieri River. Orders were to identify American positions reported by Italian informants, but the men had grown wary. Each ridge, each fold of land, could conceal an entire battalion. In his field diary, Meinhardt wrote, "We advance with eyes wide, yet trust none of what we see. Every shadow might hide a Sherman, every mist a panther or hellcat. Our men joke, but I sense genuine fear." The Invisible Division, once a name, now a reality. Reports from November had already shown that American forces had mastered the art of concealment. Shermans and Stuarts moved in small, coordinated groups, often using secondary roads and defilade positions to remain unseen. Forward observers and light infantry units, skilled in camouflage, marked targets for artillery and airstrikes, leaving German armoured units to fight a war of effects rather than direct engagement. This methodical approach left the Germans convinced they were contending with an omnipresent force, striking without warning and disappearing before retaliation. December 5 brought a significant encounter near Monte Cairo. Meinhardt's unit, a company of Panzer IVs supported by a platoon of Panzergrenadiers, attempted to advance through a narrow pass to secure high ground overlooking the Lieri Valley. Early morning fog shrouded the terrain. As the column progressed, faint tracks appeared in the mud tracks that suggested American armor had passed hours earlier. Following the tracks cautiously, the unit suddenly came under artillery fire from positions atop ridges, invisible through the mist. 2 tanks were immobilized, several men wounded. Meinhardt's after-action report recorded, "Enemy fire came from positions unseen, coordinated, and precise. No contact made, yet damage inflicted. Men speak of ghosts, though I prefer to call them professionals." This pattern repeated throughout December. German armoured reconnaissance units reported numerous phantom columns, and even the most experienced commanders struggled to rationalize the enemy's tactics. Unteroffizier Lang, who had survived the Tunisian encounters, noted, "We know they are here. We know they strike. But we see nothing. It is as if they are everywhere at once, yet nowhere." The Invisible Division had achieved its psychological goal. The mere suggestion of presence shaped German operations, inducing caution, delaying maneuvers, and creating defensive rigidity. December 10 saw a coordinated skirmish near Santa Apollonia. A Panzer IV platoon attempted to engage what was believed to be a concentrated Sherman unit. Observing dust clouds and hearing distant engine sounds, the Germans prepared an ambush, only to find empty terrain. Moments later, artillery struck German positions with devastating effect. Post-war analysis of American records indicates that elements of the 339th Fighter Squadron had provided close air support, targeting coordinates relayed by forward observers. From the German perspective, the strike appeared as if the enemy had vanished into thin air. The impact on morale was profound. Soldiers who had survived Tunisia and North Africa now confronted an enemy whose tactics were indistinguishable from legend. In letters home, some described the Invisible Division as a shadow that strikes, unseen yet deadly. Commanders, facing winter logistics and increasingly stretched supply lines, realized that operational caution, once a virtue, had become a necessity dictated by the psychological effect of an unseen adversary. Even the most disciplined units hesitated before advancing, wary of traps that could appear anywhere along the rugged valleys and ridges. December 14 brought a particularly revealing incident at the village of Piedimonte. Meinhardt's unit, acting on intelligence of an American supply convoy, advanced along a ridge to intercept. Initial reconnaissance revealed nothing, and the unit proceeded to secure the approach. Within an hour, Coordinated artillery and mortar fire disabled 2 tanks and forced the infantry to take cover. The Americans, according to captured records and post-war testimony, had used a combination of dummy tracks, controlled dust clouds, and decoy movements to mislead the Germans while a separate force positioned itself for indirect fire. The effect was indistinguishable from an encounter with a fully hidden, omnipresent, armoured division. By mid-December, the rumour had evolved into operational doctrine for some German units. Reports from several Panzergrenadier battalions included warnings to exercise extreme caution in all manoeuvres, to avoid predictable formations, and to anticipate enemy action even when no visual contact existed. The Invisible Division had become both a tactical challenge and a psychological weapon. Its presence influenced German planning, slowed advances, and amplified the effect of Allied mobility and firepower. December 20 offered yet another illustration near Monte Cassino. A German company of Panzer IVs attempted to patrol a ridge used as an American observation point. Reconnaissance detected vague movements in the early morning fog. As the column advanced, artillery and light infantry strikes disabled several vehicles and inflicted casualties without a single sighting of the enemy. German reports emphasized the difficulty of reacting to an adversary that left no tangible signature. "They strike and vanish," wrote Lieutenant Weber. "Every action of ours is anticipated. Their presence is known only by consequence." The psychological toll extended beyond the front lines. Supply officers, tasked with coordinating fuel and ammunition, reported delays caused by overcaution. Infantry units, seeking to avoid ambushes, often overextended defensive positions, creating gaps elsewhere. Commanders recognized that the Invisible Division's strategic effect had transcended tactical engagements. It reshaped the German approach to combat, forcing consideration of a threat that was as much about perception as reality. December 24, Christmas Eve, brought a rare lull. Meinhardt's company camped along a ridge, the frozen air punctuated by the distant sound of artillery. Soldiers gathered around meagre fires, exchanging stories of unseen enemies and phantom columns. In letters, some wrote home about the division of shadows and ghostly tanks, unsure if fear or respect dominated their narrative. For the Germans, the myth of the Invisible Division had solidified, not merely as rumour, but as an accepted operational challenge, a force whose presence dictated strategy, constrained movement, and compelled vigilance even in the absence of direct contact. The month ended with reconnaissance reports and diary entries reflecting a grudging admiration. The Americans had mastered the use of terrain, concealment, mobility, and coordination to create a force whose effects were tangible, even if its movements remained largely invisible. Hauptmann Fischer summarized in his command log, "We do not know their numbers, nor their exact positions. Yet we feel their hand in every valley, every ridge. The Invisible Division is real, not in the sense of a single unit, but in the operational mastery that leaves us unsure, cautious, and reactive. We fight not only their tanks and guns, but the shadow they cast upon our minds." As December 31 approached, the Gustav Line remained contested, and German units continued to encounter the effects of unseen operations. Reports of destroyed vehicles, disrupted supply lines, and ambushed patrols filled field diaries. The Invisible Division, born from whispered rumours in North Africa, had now become a concrete factor in Italian operations, demonstrating how skillful application of mobility, terrain, and psychological pressure could elevate a relatively small force into a near-mythical adversary. Even as the new year approached, the German High Command struggled to understand the phenomenon fully. While reconnaissance flights and intelligence reports attempted to catalogue the phantom movements, Allied doctrine ensured that direct contact remained limited and controlled, reinforcing the perception of invincibility and omnipresence. The Invisible Division, though a construct of operational mastery, had achieved what few divisions could. It had become a legend on the battlefield, an adversary whose influence extended far beyond its numerical strength. The 3rd of January 1944. The Italian winter had hardened into an unforgiving season. Snow dusted the peaks surrounding the Gustav Line, while frost covered the mud-choked roads and narrow passes that funneled German armor and infantry alike. For the men of the Wehrmacht, the so-called Invisible Division had ceased to be a mere rumor. It had become a defining factor in their operational reality, shaping tactics, morale, and strategic planning. Oberleutnant Karl Meinhardt's unit was ordered to conduct a reconnaissance in force along a ridge overlooking the Liri Valley. Their objective: verify reports of American armor moving through the area and secure intelligence on supply lines. Previous encounters had reinforced the perception that enemy columns could strike from unseen positions and vanish without trace. Meinhardt's field diary captured the prevailing mood. We are cautious beyond all reason, yet caution itself may not suffice. The enemy strikes without warning, yet leaves no trace. Each movement, each sound, must be analyzed for unseen adversaries. The Invisible Division has turned rumor into doctrine. The Germans were not wrong to be wary. Allied operations had become highly refined. Shermans and M4A1 variants were employed in small, coordinated groups, often moving at night or under fog cover. Reconnaissance patrols marked terrain for indirect artillery, while light infantry and paratroop units executed rapid flanking maneuvers. Coordination with American and British air support, particularly P-38 Lightning fighter bombers, amplified the sense of omnipresence. From the perspective of the Panzergrenadiers, attacks often seemed to come from multiple directions simultaneously, despite numerical inferiority. January 7 brought the most significant encounter of the month near San Pietro. A Panzer IV platoon under Meinhardt's command advanced along a winding valley road. Faint tracks in the snow suggested recent American movement. The Germans anticipated a frontal confrontation. Yet upon cresting a ridge, the valley below appeared deserted. Within minutes, artillery and mortar shells rained down from positions concealed by terrain and foliage. 2 tanks were disabled instantly, several men were wounded, and the column was forced to retreat. Meinhardt's report described the experience as a force that acts everywhere, yet reveals itself nowhere. Every encounter reinforces the belief that we are hunted by shadows. The psychological impact on German troops was profound. Units that had survived Tunisia, Kasserine, and the North African desert now faced a threat whose strength lay not in numbers alone, but in operational mastery. Rumor had given way to fear, and fear to operational paralysis. In multiple battalion reports, commanders noted a hesitancy to advance, overcautious formations, and excessive reliance on reconnaissance tactics, driven by the perception of an omnipresent, invisible foe. January 12, near Cassino itself, a German reconnaissance team attempted to verify intelligence on American movements. Using binoculars and primitive sound-ranging devices, they detected faint engine noises but no visible armor. As they moved to investigate, sniper fire and well-coordinated mortar rounds struck from concealed positions. Captured American records later revealed the use of small Sherman and Stuart units, integrated with artillery observers who deliberately manipulated dust, clouds, and snow cover to suggest larger formations. To the German soldiers on the ground, it appeared as though an entire division had materialized from nowhere to strike and then vanish. By mid-January, the legend of the Invisible Division had become fully institutionalized. Field manuals and intelligence bulletins referred to enemy movements that appear coordinated yet leave no physical trace. Panzergrenadier officers routinely warned subordinates to expect contact at any time, even in areas previously deemed secure. The effect extended beyond the front lines. Supply convoys delayed their movements. Field hospitals reinforced positions in anticipation of strikes, and command staff revised operational plans to account for attacks that could come without warning. The strategic implications were clear. Allied forces had achieved more than tactical success. They had instilled a persistent uncertainty among German commanders. Every engagement, whether in the Liri Valley, along the Aurunci Mountains, or near the Abbey at Monte Cassino, reinforced the perception of a superior, invisible adversary. The Germans' inability to locate or engage the enemy decisively allowed relatively small American units to exert influence disproportionate to their numbers. January 20 brought an illustrative skirmish near the Rapido River. Meinhardt's company moved to intercept a reported American supply column. Despite careful preparation, the unit encountered only frozen earth and faint tracks. Within an hour, indirect fire struck their positions with precision, and retreating infantry reported distant vehicle noises, suggesting flanking maneuvers from multiple directions. Post-war records confirmed that small American task forces had deliberately used decoys, mobility, and terrain manipulation to simulate a larger presence. The Germans, however, believed they were confronting a division capable of moving unseen and striking unpredictably, reinforcing the myth that had haunted them since Tunisia.